Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to present what I've been working on. I've been looking at the civil society in Singapore for the past 10 years. Wait, well, that's a lie, right? I don't. Um, Actually, that's my first question when David asked me to talk here. I said, so David said, Rita, why don't you speak about civil society? And I said, David, I thought your event is about Singapore. And he said, yeah, it's about Singapore. And I said, David, you know that I am studying mostly Indonesia, right? And he said, but you live in Singapore for the past 8 years. And I said, yeah, that's true. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Future Civic Engagement in Singapore Urban Planning. I won't pretend that I really know the future of civic engagement in Singapore because I may not know very well about the situation now as well. But this is all what I perceive from my my experience being here in Singapore and being exposed to several activities that you can call civic engagement and civil society activities in Singapore, trying to play a role in urban planning to a certain extent. And just a disclaimer, this picture is not from Singapore. This one was from one of my field sites in Jakarta, in which they're trying to do participatory planning. Not necessarily engaging with the government, but is participating in designing their own communities. But do we actually talk about these kinds of civic engagement if we talk about civic engagement in Singapore? And I would comfortably say no. I haven't even seen anything like this in the past 8 years in Singapore. I've seen some gatherings that are quite big, but not so much. These pictures are all from Jakarta. The movement against reclamation, the labor May Day rally in Jakarta with tens of thousands of people swarming the streets, rejection of the militarization of Papua. But no, in Singapore we may not see those things, but I believe that it doesn't mean that there's no civil society. This was one that I found when I was here as a student about more than 10 years ago. I was here as a student, as a Master of Urban Design student, and I got introduced to the existence of this group in the past, the Singapore Planning and Urban Research Group, which is called SPUR, in 1965. And this is a group that is basically a coalition of different actors in civil society trying to submit proposals to the government of how Singapore should develop. They have dissolved. They deregistered as a society in 1975, but some of the actors are still active now in Singapore. More recently, this was introduced to me actually by coincidentally. I used to work in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy right after I finished my dissertation, so I got a job as a research fellow there. And it just happened that a colleague who was working also in Lee Kuan Yew School was Claire Leo. So she was one of the activists in Bukit Brown, and I got introduced to Bukit Brown through her. And if you remember, this started in 2000. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was in 2011 that the government announced that there will be a portion of the cemetery that will be taken away to make way for a road, basically. There was a movement to advocate to preserve Bukit Brown because primarily the plan, when you look at the plan of Singapore, the whole Bukit Brown is already slated for residential. So it will go in the future. So these groups, they are trying to raise awareness and introduce try to remind people what Bukit Brown is. And this is another thing that I observed in the past 8 years. In 2010, the Kereta Trans-Malaysia closed operation in Singapore, and so there was a space that was freed up, and this nature corridor was a proposal that was submitted by the Nature Society to basically just preserve it as it is. We know that it's prime real estate, but just preserve it as it is. And so this corridor is still, so far, it's still green until now. And I should say that probably this is not like all the movements, rallies that you saw in my first slide from Jakarta, but I would say that these kinds of initiatives still exist in Singapore, and they're still active. And probably you recognize the picture there, second row, third from left. And this was from the conference titled Singapore Dreaming. And so the initiator of this project was actually part of Spur in 1965, William Lim, and he was still running quite a few initiatives, events. In this particular event, he invited the speakers to present their dreams about Singapore. And basically, the dream can be anything. It's like the exercise that we did just now. What do you want Singapore to be in 2066? That exercise involved academics, such as Professor Chua, as well as artists, and also including activists of Bukit Brown as well. And besides those kinds of activities, we also find these sort of smaller initiatives in neighborhoods that may be more mundane, but they are initiatives of the people of Singapore. And if you know, in Singapore here, if most people live in public housing flats, 80% of the population. And if you live in public housing flats, you most likely don't have a garden. And most likely you don't stay on the first floor even. So if you want to plant something, you better plant it somewhere in your balcony, within your flat. Try to occupy the corridor. And in some cases, the people actually utilize the greeneries outside the buildings. And this is actually illegal. But some of them still do it, and some of them did deal with the town council. And there was a research on this. I just attended a conference 2 days ago at SUTD. The title of the conference was On Cities and Citizenship. And one of the presenters presented their project that followed some of these sort of ground-up initiatives that the people just try to plant things, try to create space, and in some cases they got warnings from the town council several times. They still have to pay fine, and then got called to court and stuff like that. But still, these kinds of more mundane initiatives, they are also something to be looked at when we talk about civic engagement in Singapore. And so, now, let's get out of Singapore a little bit, and why I think it's important to still think about civic engagement in Singapore. So Singapore, I would say that whatever is happening in Singapore doesn't just stay in Singapore. Ananya has presented very well on how the ideas actually travel to other places in the region. And if you see this image here at the bottom, it's not Singapore River, okay? That's actually the suburbs of Surabaya. And if you try to figure out what is the scale of this thing, it's 1-to-1, okay? It's the exact replica of the Merlion. And this estate prides itself as the Singapore of Surabaya. Why is it the Singapore of Surabaya? Oh, because it has a Merlion, it's clean, it has the Fountain of Wealth, it has a Raffles statue, and it's also very safe. It's so safe, it's safer from the actual city of Surabaya. It's so safe that even the US consulate in Surabaya decided to move to the Singapore of Surabaya. All right. And if you think that, that's kind of a very sort of like postmodern interpretation of how ideas travel, right? So this is another way of the travel of ideas of Singapore. Singapore has expanded and by reclaiming land. So, but if we just look inside the region of Southeast Asia, the idea of reclaiming land to expand cities, you would think that it's because they are limited, but it's not just Singapore. So the picture here is Phnom Penh there. They expand, this is called Diamond Island. It's a reclaimed land, complete with its own version of Marina Bay Sands. So if you just Google Diamond Island Riviera apartments, you would be stunned of how similar it is with Marina Bay Sands. And also Jakarta is planning one, which, one of the pictures of the demonstrations before was against this project, and also this was in Bali. And in my exchanges with the activists in Bali and in Jakarta, both of them asked me, can you tell us more about the reclamation in Singapore? And I said, why? And they said, because the developer said they keep referring to how good Singapore is. And all developed cities should have reclaimed land. And that's real story. So I was telling them, look, I don't think those documents are available for the public, but if you want, I can connect you to people who are looking into this. But yes, so whatever happens in Singapore doesn't stay in Singapore. This just happened last week. They say that they were political activists, but basically they were trying to get support for this particular candidate for governor in Jakarta, who is allegedly trying to make Jakarta like Singapore. And so they think that the Indonesians who stay in Singapore, who still hold Jakarta identity cards, they would likely to vote for this guy. So these people traveled to Singapore to try to collect support, meaning collect photocopies of their identity cards to support this candidacy. They actually traveled to Singapore to do this. Of course, they were deported, but it also shows on how much the idea of Singapore really affect the imaginations of cities in the region. So, as the civil society in Singapore, I would assume that a lot of us today are actually part of the civil society in Singapore. I would really echo what Tai Keng Soon said during the 50th anniversary of Spur last year. He said that people think that Singapore has accomplished so much and there's nothing they can contribute. That's not true. And please keep in mind that that's not true, because as civil society in Singapore, it's not just about Singapore. The role of the civil society in Singapore also may travel outside Singapore. Thank you.